Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Mentor Project's Optimizing Your Success show. I am Dr. Ruth Gotian. I study extreme high achiever and achievers, and I have lots of them here today, including our usual panel, Dr. Bruce Wiley, a writer, journalist, professor, systems modeler, computational and digital health expert, and Susie Katz, an award-winning photographer and founder of Photo Wings, which helps people think creatively through photography. And of course, our favorite three-time Olympian, Devin Harris, who is an original member of the Jamaican bobsledding team featured in that movie we all love, Cool Runnings. And our super special guest today is Dr. Valerie Fridland, all the way from Nevada. You're still there, right?
I am. And I'm hopefully no other Nevadans are listening or they're going to tag you on saying Nevada.
Oh, Nevada. Nevada. And Valerie is a good friend and a mentor of within the Mentor Project. And she is a sociolinguist and an expert in all things languages. And if you ever wondered what the word of the year is going to be, Valerie is one of the people on that team who helps make that decision. Now, I have heard Valerie's talk several times about language, and I didn't even know that there were so many differences between and ah, but apparently there is, and how you use that language, especially when you speak, can make a huge difference. Now, Valerie and I actually co-authored an article together in Nature, which I know Dr. Debbie Heiser in the background, the CEO of the Mentor Project, she's busy making us all look fabulous. And I know she's going to put it up there, which was really, Valerie, our article together was really about how to use language to grab your virtual audience's attention. But before we get to that, Valerie, how in the world did you get so interested in language?
That's a really good question. I sometimes wonder myself. It was one of those natural evolutions that you don't plan; it just sort of happens. But and there I go with an I'm going to pepper my speech with them just to illustrate them. I'm putting them in there artificially. I was actually born to parents that were not native English speakers, and I think growing up in the South with parents who were French native speakers. And were called out often by other people. So everywhere we went, people asked my parents where they were from. People used to always make fun of the way my mom said my name, because she would go, Valerie. And they would usually say it in a way that meant they loved it. But still, language was always something that my parents drew to my attention, mainly because of their sort of otherness or foreignness. So I was interested in language from that perspective. And then when I went to college, I was interested in studying other languages. I didn't even think about it at the time, what might have driven that interest. But I became a Chinese major in college at Georgetown. And as a part of that requirement, I had to take 6 linguistics courses, and then the rest is history. So after I took those courses, I just fell in love with the underbelly of language, the dirty little secrets that no one knows. And I really just wanted at that point to learn more and more about it. So I took language and gender, I took language and disadvantage, I looked at sociolinguistics, or the language and social life kind of nexus, as where I wanted to do my graduate work. And I went on for a PhD in theoretical linguistics, and then I ended up as a professor. So it all worked out.
And here we are.
Yes.
And here we are. And you were the head of the graduate program, and you had every single title that you could muster. And you've written some books, and you have another book coming out. Tell us a little bit about that book.
I do. So I have written a number of books, but most of them would be ones that would put most people that are not linguists to sleep. So other than the 200 other linguists that want to read those, I decided it was time to talk to people that actually speak, because a lot of times I give talks and people come up to me afterwards and they have really good questions, and they're fascinated by this sort of underside of language, the ways that it works in the unconscious mind. And we are not even aware that we do these things, but we do them, and they're very socio-stylistically important, which means we have a toolbox of linguistic resources that we choose from to make our identities change. First of all, we have certain social facts about us, like gender, age, or race, that come through in our speech. But also, we have groups that we're members of. We have authority we want to project. We have friendliness we want to emit. And all of those things are done through language. So I thought, well, let me write a book about that side of language, because that's really the side of language people don't read about very often. And it evolved into this book about all the things we love to hate in our own speech. So whether we say like too much, whether we or whether we say walking and talking instead of walking and talking, how our kids call everybody dude, all these little things that we think are just annoying parts of speech.
They are annoying, Valerie.
I won't convince you otherwise. They're actually revolutionary. They're novelties. They're innovation. They are the whole reason we don't speak like the language of Beowulf today. It's that same linguistic evolution that has been happening in English since time eternal that we don't see because it's right in front of us. If we look back 300 years and we look at the things that people hated then, what we'll find is most of the things we love today are things they hated 300 years ago. So if we look at language through the lens of linguistic science and through the lens of history, we see an entirely different side to the things that we love to hate today. I may not make you love them, but at least I'll make you understand them. So my next book is that book that will be coming out yet untitled with Viking Penguin in spring of 2023, everywhere books are sold, hopefully.
Beautiful. Now, I remember you were writing and we were chatting about it. Now, let's talk a little bit about all of these annoying things that we have in the language, which have infused their way into it, such as the vocal fry, such as the word like. Where did that come from, and how can we get rid of it?
Which one? Vocal fry, like, or all of the above?
All of the above, please.
Well, let's start with like. So we tend to think of like as what? Where do you hear like the most? Who do you think of?
Teenagers.
Teenagers. Anything else?
I actually hear adults. I hear my generation. I don't even know what my generation is.
Right. We often associate it with young people, but you're right, Ruth. If you look around, people of all ages say it. And the stereotypical like user is a young female teenager, probably from Southern California, right? If you listen to the stereotypes, that tends to be what we portray. The really interesting thing about like used as a discourse marker, it has been around about 300 years.
Hold on. What's a discourse marker?
A discourse marker is a feature of speech that doesn't really contribute to the informational content, but it contributes to the social meaning or the social greasing of our conversation. So things like, well, so, you know, like, okay, all of these are signposts that we put in our speech that if you take them out, don't really take away semantic content or the true meaning of the literal meaning of the sentence. But what they add is signposting for a listener to either know that I'm going to say something that's different than you expected. I'm going to say something important. I'm going to say something connected to what somebody just said, or I want to highlight certain or focus on certain aspects of information. Every time we say something in conversation, we usually have a discourse marker that connects it to what has been said before. Like is actually, in many cases, a discourse marker. Discourse markers have been around since Old English. And in fact, Beowulf starts with one. It starts with a what, which at the time was the equivalent of bro, essentially. So, you know, even though we think it's bad today, we've been doing it forever. And Shakespeare made many liberal uses of discourse markers. So they are here to stay. We just tend to like some of them better than others. So if I say herewith, you may think, oh, wow, there's an intelligent speaker. But if I say like, I don't know, then you're going to think, oh, teenage idiot, right? So the whole process is the same. We just form likes and dislikes, which is an odd word choice in this context, attached to certain variables or certain discourse markers because of our associations with those. And because the Valley Girl image really popularized like use, we started to associate that kind of image with it. It actually was used more widely during the 1950s in the beatnik associations. But prior to that, we actually found it in Britain in 100-year-old speakers, generally in rural communities. So it's actually not new at all. And the earliest attestation or notice in written work of like used as a discourse marker is in the 1600s and 1700s. So it's not new. We tend to think of it as new. What's happened though is it's very common, and it started to be very much more purposefully used than it was 50 years ago. So new things attract notice, which is exactly why we do them. And teenagers are usually the ones leading in those changes because they are the ones that want some linguistic notice. As we get older, we kind of want to fade into the background. We don't want to rock the linguistic boat, but teenagers want everything that is rocking any boats. So like is just a repurposed discourse marker. There's also a quotative like, which is another way of saying to say, that has also emerged in the 20th century. And between those two forms of like, we feel that like is everywhere, but they're actually very different likes. They have a different purpose. And there's some really interesting linguistic and social motivations behind why we use them. So while we may not like them, they actually have a very long history. They're in line with a whole host of other cohesive discourse markers that do a lot of work for us. And they're actually found in all speakers today. So while it may seem like young people use them more, older people are starting to adopt them at a much faster rate, which means that probably 50 years from now, we won't even notice them anymore. They'll just be part of our speech.
Oh, wow. And how about the vocal fries? And maybe give an example of what that is.
Fry. So vocal fry is what linguists call creak or creaky phonation. And that is a very Kim Kardashian-esque way of, at the end of a utterance or end of a sentence, lowering your voice pitch so that your vocal folds basically kind of pop. And that would be something like, I don't know about that. I don't like that. What do you think? Right? Where it comes off as this sort of popcorn popping, kind of hitting a rail with a stick sort of noise. A lot of people find it very grating. Where it's been particularly noticed is, this is a sort of funny place to notice it, but NPR correspondents, female NPR correspondents have been roundly criticized. In fact, there was an entire show devoted on a podcast on NPR to all the hate mail they receive because of how many people hate the vocal fry of their female correspondents. It's particularly disliked with women, although it's actually more prevalent in terms of the glottal phonation style, which is where the larynx is involved in making speech, from men, because it tends to happen at low pitches. So historically, vocal fry had been studied in men, and it was considered in Britain in the 1980s when it was studied a feature mainly of male speech, of upper crust male speech, and it sort of had a connotation of I'm too good, I don't really care. But as it became used by women, particularly women in positions of power, it actually started to degrade in its association, so that now it's found annoying and grating and something young women do and that they shouldn't. What's interesting is the reason that young women are doing it is because there are all sorts of pieces of evidence that suggest when we speak with a very high pitch, women are construed as weak and ineffective and not good leaders. And so in workplaces or in journalism, where you want to express authority and power, having a high vocal pitch is certainly not going to do it for you. Not only are you less attractive to men, or not only are you less attractive, but you're also less powerful. And so by adopting slightly lower pitch, by putting on vocal fry at the end of your intonation pattern, you can come across as having an overall lower pitch, which makes you seem like you have more authority and power. So probably why we're doing it more is because women are more in the workplace, and a low pitch in the workplace is considered a better attribute. And in fact, we look at research on CEOs with lower voice pitch tend to make more money. So all in all, there's all sorts of reasons why we should vocal.
Is that why Margaret Thatcher lowered her voice?
It is. She lowered her vocal pitch over time. Now, she didn't have a lot of vocal fry, but she actually went about 50 hertz lower over time. As she became the prime minister, to try to be have more authority. At the time, there were very few women in positions of power, and so that it was seen as sort of adopting more male characteristics. But it was really an early prescient view of how people like to have low-pitched leaders. And in fact, if you look at research, you find that presidential elections and senatorial elections generally fall in line with voice pitch. So if you look at the actual outcomes of elections, for senatorial races or congressional races, it tends to be people with lower pitch that get elected. There was a really interesting retroactive study of the 2012 elections that looked at how voice pitch was related to electability, and people with lower voice pitch tended to fare better. And same thing with some presidential elections. So what?
Okay, so Valerie.
Yes.
So on the flip side of that, how about all the people who end every sentence as if it's a question? And you know what I'm talking about, that uptalk, which to me is even worse than vocal fry. How do we get rid of that?
Well,
Because
see,
that's really
the
bad.
wrong person. You're asking the wrong person. I am not a get rid of that person. I am that. Let me help you understand why it happens. Yes, uptalk is also something that's very hated. And let's look at a theme here. Who do we hate doing uptalk? Who do we accuse of doing uptalk the most?
Women.
Women. Okay, so let's look at how we've narrowed down some vocal attributes we hate. Like use, young teenagers, predominantly women. Vocal fry, predominantly young women. Uptalk, predominantly young women. So who are we actually hating here?
Women.
Ooh,
Young
Valerie.
women.
Women, yeah.
Young women. If you look at the most despised vocal features, they tend to either be associated with ethnic variation or with gender variation, because we tend to like the dominant or mainstream powerful speech models. And because that tends not to be women, right, then women's speech tends to be looked at disfavorably. There's also a lot of historical reasons why women's speech is disparaged. It's been since the time of Aristotle that we have not really liked the way that women sound. And in fact, they shouldn't be talking at all. So over time, these two different pieces of women supposedly being silent and not having opinions, and women sort of encroaching into men's domain, has created this situation where the speech attributes that are associated with young women tend to be the ones that we discourage, despise, and hold them accountable for in workplaces. So uptalk is another one of those examples. Again, if you look at the history of studies of uptalk, it was mainly studied in Australia first, and not among young women, among men. But did we hear lots of things about, oh my God, all the young men are using uptalk, let's shut them up? We don't hear that, not because young men don't do it, but because young men aren't called out for doing it, because it's associated with the women's speech styles, and therefore it's easiest to hate the weak link, which is women's speech.
Hi, Valerie.
How do you feel bad, Ruth?
Well, so I had to give a presentation at one point, and I studied with a theatrical coach, and she said to try to keep as even as possible and to end your sentence kind of on the up, but not as much as you're speaking about. I think it makes for a more smooth presentation. Could you speak to that?
It's right. So the reason we do uptalk is it's, again, just like vocal fry. It's sort of the opposite of vocal fry. It's not a down pitch, it's an up pitch. And we do it to allow sort of a opportunity for us to continue speaking a lot of times. So when we end on a uptalk note at the end of a sentence, that signals to a listener that I'm not done, that I'm going to continue talking. So it signals them to stay listening and keep the interest. It also allows for some pitch variation. And Ruth, like you and I discussed in that article, when we use a very monotonous pitch, it's not very interesting to listen to. So theatrically speaking, varying your pitch, which uptalk would do, it's an up pitch pattern, would actually add to listener interest. So it kind of has two benefits. It signals, look, I'm not done, keep listening. So don't go to sleep there, dude, wake up. And it also allows a little bit of mixture to keep someone's interest, so they're not falling into that, oh yeah, monotone sleep, right? Where you're listening to the same person drone on and on and on, and then you're tired. But if someone adds a little pitch interest, it wakes you up. And so there's two benefits from a theatrical perspective to using uptalk in your speech.
So Valerie, you said that you're not the kind of let me solve this, but the why understand why this is happening. But so when I'm listening to the idea of vocal fry, it seems like women are caught between a rock and a hard place, right? If they speak in a low tone, then they're seen as trying to be masculine. And if they speak in higher pitches, so what's a girl to do?
Well, that's why vocal fry became popular, right? Because it's sort of the intermediate. Interesting.
We're supposed to be quiet, Evan.
Right. You say nothing. The really interesting research on vocal pitch. So vocal pitch is different than either uptalk or vocal fry. Pitch is the pattern of sort of the tone of your voice on average. So everybody has an average pitch, which is the way that we recognize someone calling us on the telephone, for example. We get used to people's average pitch, but your pitch variation is whether you go up and down in pitch over time. And a lot of us do that just naturally over the course of the day. So when we're talking about just pitch in general, we're talking about average pitch, just the general frequency of vibration of your vocal folds on average. And men's vocal folds are much heavier than women's, basically because they tend to be bigger. And so they vibrate more slowly, like a thick rubber band, right? So these are your vocal folds. And if they're flapping like this to get the air through, they're going to make a lower vibration, which gives you a lower average pitch. Women's vocal folds tend to be thinner, and they're more tightly stretched. So it's like a little rubber band. If you ping it, it makes a higher pitch because it's vibrating much faster. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about pitch, your average frequency of vibration of your vocal folds. Uptalk and vocal fry are both other aspects of pitch that we put on, that we're able to do to have sort of social meaning as we're talking, or to signal something to a listener. So that's a little different than pitch. Studies suggest that high pitch in women is considered physically attractive. So males prefer females with high pitched voices because it seems to signal something about fertility. Do with what you want with that, right? So it's basically on Tinder, you want a high pitch, but in the boardroom, we found that it's not attractive from a business perspective because probably of the association of largeness and physical power with low pitch. So women are in the rock and the hard place there because to be attractive, which our culture places a lot of value on, they have to have a high pitch. To be professional and a leader and powerful and have authority, they need to have a low average pitch. So vocal fry is a way to do both because you're not changing your average pitch. Your average pitch stays higher. What you're changing is excursions or sort of trips into a slightly lower pitch range as you're doing the vocal fry. So if you listen to vocal fry, it's not a consistent, it tends not to be a consistent pattern in someone's speech. It's towards the end of a sentence, right before a pause point. So they dip into sort of what gives the impression of a lower pitch. But at the same time, they're holding a higher pitch on average. And therefore, they kind of get the best of both worlds, except for people that hate vocal fry. But usually people hate it when it's really obvious. A lot of times we dip into a lower pitch to try to maintain some semblance of professional authority while we have our general average pitch that's slightly higher. So that is one of the ways women have adapted. Unfortunately, they haven't been able to do it that successfully, as we see from all the complaints about trying to vary their pitch. So it is, they're definitely in a rock and a hard place, which is why I want to make sure people understand these are physiological processes, and they're also sociolinguistic processes that are driven by cultural norms and beliefs that we have that make women feel like they have to motivate or moderate their pitch in these ways.
It's funny when you talk about that, I get two things come to my mind. One is being disciplined, and the other is Lauren Bacall's very sultry voice.
Well, that's breathy voice. That's breathy voice. That's a little different. So there are breathy voice. This is a sort of a lesson in laryngeal configurations. Try say that word 5 times fast. That'll get you a lot of friends at a cocktail party. Laryngeal configurations.
Laryngeal configuration.
These are all the positions of the larynx that you can manipulate to make different sounds come out in addition to your average pitch. So average pitch is simply how the airflow is being pushed through your vocal folds and how they're vibrating. But you can actually hold the vocal folds, which are like 2 meaty flaps in your throat, at different positions. And so breathy voice is actually when you're pushing the air through, and I don't know if you can see my hands, there's a little slit in them. It's where you have a slit in the vocal folds at the bottom so that air rushes through and gives off a kind of breathy articulation. And so most of the husky voiced women that we think are sultry and sexy are ones that have a lot of breathiness in their voice, meaning that they either naturally or due to sort of putting it on have a little more laryngeal openness when they're speaking. And so that air is also just freely flowing through, giving off this sense of breathy, sexy sultriness.
This is so complicated.
It's
So
very
much.
complicated.
I think I have to just contort myself. I have to remember when I go out, I need a lower pitch. When I'm at work,
Exactly.
I know when I go out, I need the higher pitch. When I'm at work, I need the lower pitch. Too complicated.
It's
So
very
can I ask,
you don't have to
does
do
that,
anything.
I'm just going to
you're
be
saying
me.
that linguistically, all of us, but women in particular, have to be chameleons, right? Because you say we make our identities change through the language that we use.
Right. Well, think about your own speech. I mean, we are naturally chameleons linguistically. We don't use the same speech when we go home after a long day at work with our friends and our family. You know, when we go out to the bar and we hang out with our friends, we are definitely not using the same language we use in front of our boss. Well, some of us may be. It depends on the type of boss you have. But generally speaking, we do this naturally. It's called your linguistic repertoire. So we all have a linguistic repertoire. The only difference is for some of us, we need more pieces to that repertoire to be successful. So if you're a white male, you don't actually vary your speech that much typically, especially if you're middle class, because that's the valued speech in America. That's the valued speech in most places, right? And so the repertoire is less expansive because white men can kind of say whatever they want, wherever they want, and it doesn't really have the same impact in terms of devaluing them. If they use sort of a more surly speech, it just builds up their sort of image, but it doesn't really harm them. But if a woman makes those same choices, it's usually more detrimental. So women have to be more careful, and certainly ethnic speakers have to be extremely careful. And they have a much broader repertoire because they have to operate in very different worlds, where a lot of speakers of ethnic varieties or dialects have to draw from standard speech when they're at the workplace or for professional success. But at home, the speech in their homes and with their friends is actually usually a cultural determined dialect that's very different from the one that might be valued at work. So we're all linguistic chameleons. Some of us are just more chameleon-like than others.
Yeah.
Wow. So let me ask you this. Susie was telling you about a talk that she had to give, and I'm curious if that was your TED Talk. It was. And then I know Devin speaks on very big stages. He gives, based on his Olympic experiences, he really gives a lot of motivational and very inspirational talks. And Bruce is on television all the time, where he needs to get a very important message out in a very short, brief period of time. And he does that to the lay public, where on the other hand, he can give scientific talks where he may have more time to a different type of audience. So if each of us was going to capture our unique audience's attention, what are some tips that you would give someone who gives a motivational and inspirational talk versus someone who's talking to either on television for brief snippets or an academic talk? Or how do we get people to stay awake
to that? Well, you know, a lot of it is also pitch, right? We talked about if you want to get people's interest, you have to vary your pitch. And that's true in any context. But if you're doing short snippets, you have to worry about that less because you're not holding their attention for an hour. So when you go and you say something for 2 minutes, people hopefully are interested in the content of what you say because you should have distilled it down to the very facts that you want to convey. You don't have an hour to fill. When you do have an hour to fill, so Devin, I'm sure you give motivational talks that are pretty long, you're going to have to spice it up linguistically speaking. So one of the things you can do is vary your voice pitch. You make sure you're not monotonous, but I imagine Devin does that pretty naturally. When we look at charisma, at ratings of charisma, what we find is people with more variable voice pitch are rated higher on charisma. So obviously voice pitch is very important to that picture. So that's one thing. Also, what we choose to say can be more interesting or less interesting. So for example, intensifiers are adverbial modifiers that help us boost the intensity of what we're saying. A lot of times we're told not to use these things. These are things like extremely, completely, very, really, so, because they seem they are in place of more descriptive language. But actually, we often when we talk for an hour, use a lot of descriptive language. And if we don't tell people, this is something important, pay attention to this, I want to boost the message, I want a hyperbolic response to this, you're not going to be signposting to anybody what's more important to listen to. So something in a longer speech would be to use some intensification. He was really interested in this, and then he did this completely without notice, right? Those kinds of ly adjectives or adverbials really help boost what you say. You want to use them sparingly, though, because if you use them too much, you're saying, look at this, look at this, look at this. You basically want to make sure you're planned and strategic in where you place them so that you're highlighting what's most important about your message.
So Devin, you could say, I'm really afraid of heights.
And actually do say that, yeah. I usually have a comment. I'm like, people don't believe me because I joke around a lot, but I'm really afraid of heights. And they laugh, and it's true.
But it's so true.
So Valerie, I usually try to speak in nothing but discourse markers. Is that a problem?
I love it. I think I think that should be our model. Nothing but discourse markers. Well, definitely if you don't use discourse markers, people tend to think you're robotic in your speech. So no matter whether you're giving a long speech or a short one, it's always good to be coherent and cohesive. You just have to be aware of the things that people tend not to like. So while as a linguist, I value the diversity in what we say, as a professional, I think you have to be aware of things like and so and totally not being highly favorably received. So you just have to be strategic in your choice of which ones to use.
I'm going to start using here with.
Henceforth.
Yeah, Valerie, in your world, how do you describe or talk about pauses as opposed to like or
like silent pauses?
So as we were saying, I was there yesterday and.
Right. So pauses actually are interesting because we tend to not like them depending on our cultural background. Americans, for example, are not very comfortable with pauses. And this has been something that has really affected Zoom presentations and Zoom meetings because there actually is a lag in Zoom that doesn't happen in real life. And so we're already not favorably disposed to silence. And then you throw in a unnatural Zoom lag and people start to shift in their seats and overtalk. So what you find is people tend to either be okay with that because they're from a cultural background where silence is valued. And this would be someone like a Japanese speaker or a Finn. They tend to have a lot longer tolerance for silence. They do really well in virtual meetings. However, Americans don't do well at all because we don't like that kind of silence. So when you are having a cross-cultural meeting, you end up with people that either feel over talked to because Americans tend to jump in and over talk with silence, or people that feel like no one's interested because they're so good with silence that you sit there and let it happen. So silence can be many things to many people, but it's usually a good thing because it allows other people to talk. So you probably need to give a little more silence, a little more pause than we typically do when we're on Zoom.
Now, Valerie, let's talk a little bit. I remember we had discussions that people think that those who speak quickly are more intelligent, but you don't agree with that.
Well, I don't think that there's any such thing as someone who's a more intelligent speaker because of the way they speak. These are our sort of social beliefs that we have, these ideologies based on what we tend to think about certain types of speakers. So, for example, Southerners, we have these cultural stereotypes about Southerners. We also believe that Southerners speak more slowly. And as a Southerner and someone that you've just listened to, I think you can say I attest the opposite. So these beliefs that we have about Southerners being sort of slow and dumb, which is the cultural stereotype about Southerner, tends to then get put on their slowness in speech. There are some competing studies about whether Southerners are actually in fact slower speakers or if simply they have longer vowels, which gives off the impression of slower speech because Southerners do tend to have longer vowels, but they may actually have just the same amount of speech time when they use their consonants combined with vowels. But there is no such thing as someone being a more intelligent speaker because of the features that they choose. The impression we get, though, when you look at studies is that faster speakers come across better. So there's a big difference between what really happens in terms of are you intelligent or not intelligent by your choice of speech features, and what we think happens in terms of what someone else thinks about you because of the way you talk.
What about the folks? I've seen situations where there are some folks that they'll say a lot and then people will be impressed, but then if you actually look at what they said, they didn't say a whole lot. Are they using some type of
Smoke
like-
and mirrors.
I hope you're not saying
Smoke
that
and
for
mirrors,
our
Bruce.
discussion tonight. But yeah, I think that's a different thing. That's less linguistic and more in terms of what speech is valued. So I know if you look at a lot of times political pundits, for example, they're trying to hedge. So that could be considered hedging talk. And I think that's more about your motivations and whether you want to be deceptive or sort of unclear or vague about what you're trying to say. You tend to use more vague language, and vague language allows you to get away with things. So there, you could probably come up with a corpus study that looked at what are vague language forms, and one would be hedging, like I think, I mean, kind of, sort of. Other things would be using non-descriptive words or adjectives that were descriptive of large things, not small things, not very specific or descriptive. And you probably could come up with some studies that suggested, political speech tend to have higher rates of those things, but I don't know per se of anything that has been looked at in that area.
So Valerie, I think we're hitting another COVID wave, and I think we're going to be back to Zoom meetings constantly for quite a while. And I was hoping that you can give each of us tips on how we could make the most of these endless Zoom meetings that we're on, how to make sure that people are actually paying attention. How do we keep their attention for a presentation or for a meeting? Things we should say, not say, do, not do. I know I snuck in an there.
Well,
curious.
umming is great. That's another conversation, but there's nothing wrong with an here or there. Unfortunately, I think you're right. And even if we don't have a problem with COVID, I think that Zoom meetings are here to stay because people have realized that we can do a lot of good things with Zoom meetings. Unfortunately, most of the time we feel a lot of bad things about Zoom meetings, even if they're actually helping us reach across miles. One of the things that we tend not to do is make time for chat on Zoom meetings because we feel like, oh my God, I'm on another Zoom meeting. I've been on 10 already today. Can we just get this over? I'm going to turn off my microphone. I'm going to turn off my camera, and I'm going to sleep while Jim Bob over there gives his presentation, which may be great for my eye bags, but it's not very good for Jim Bob or for building a team. And teams are really what we do well with in corporations. In order to build teams, you have to have some social connection. In fact, if you look at research on connectedness, they tend to be more effective in business settings. So if you don't have that social connectiveness, which we don't tend to get on Zoom, in fact, some of us have never even met our colleagues, then you are going to build people that don't have trust in being free to say what they think, in sharing their ideas. They don't value each other, and this leads to less effective meetings. So one of the ways that we can try to accomplish this is by building back some of that social connectedness, even if we're not in the same space. One of the things that you can do for this is have social aspects to your meeting, which we tend not to do. Have rules to your meeting, which we often don't do, surprisingly, in company context. People are sort of left to their own devices to figure out what the etiquette is. Keep your mic on, keep your camera on. Make sure that you are engaged and interested in what other people are saying so that they'll do the same for you. But importantly, ask people questions about themselves. People want to talk. People are really hungry for that kind of social nurturing. And if we just Zoom in and we don't get to know each other besides, oh, here are the annual reports, or here's some lovely figures you can look at, here's some ways to make money, if you don't have anything else to grasp, then you're going to leave that company. You're going to be less happy at that company, and you're going to feel less psychologically safe to share your opinion at that company. So it's really, really important that we build in space for social exchanges. It's called phatic communication. Have a period at the beginning of every meeting where you have sort of a lag before the meeting starts, and have someone appointed to ask people questions if people don't do it naturally. I think we've all been on those meetings where everybody's just sitting there waiting for the meeting to start. That's a perfect opportunity for phatic communication. Other things are smaller chat rooms. If you can break people down, even if that's sort of not your typical sphere, to have them talk to each other. When 3 people are in a chat room, they're going to have to talk, and they'll usually do some sort of social exchange versus looking at 25 people on a screen. So those are 2 very simple things. The other thing is to have rules about turn taking. So how much should someone talk? What are the expectations for conversation in a meeting? Even if it's not social niceties, we should expect people in meetings to have things to say. If we don't give people instructions on when they should talk, how long they should talk, who should be talking, then people tend not to talk at all. Or they take it as license to do all the talking, and we all know that person. So I think the best thing that we can do is have some rules before we go in, as the administrator of a meeting, as the boss, as whoever is organizing the meeting, say, I want to hear from everybody in this meeting. We're going to go round robin style, and I want each of you to contribute. Or we can say, we're going to talk on X, Y, and Z topics. I want everybody working on X topic to prepare a 5-minute intro. I want everybody working on Y topic to prepare a 5-minute intro. If you do those things before the meetings become more effective, because A, people are better prepared, and B, people are more represented. And when people feel like they have a space to talk, then they feel more valued in that space. So I think those are a few just simple ideas of how we can make our meetings more successful.
I know I loved you, Valerie, because this is a lot of what we do in adult learning. And if you ask Stephen Brookfield, he'll say, whenever you have small groups, you always have the lowest ranked person speak first.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's the highest ranked person, they set the tone, and you're always afraid to disagree with that person. So if you have the lowest ranked person speak first, they have a clean slate, they can say anything, and then people can build on that. And it's also a great way for the more junior people to be able to have these connections and these relationships with people who are senior to them. So we come from two different sides, but I think we're part of the same coin, Valerie.
Absolutely. And actually, a really good way to do that is to have open-ended questions lead off those kinds of chats.
Yeah.
One of the problems with having junior people go first is people tend to feel inhibited in Zoom context, much more than even in a physical meeting space. So if you sort of throw out, the lamb, here's the junior person, let's throw him out, see if he gets eaten. People can feel that, and it can have a sort of effect on how much they share or what they are free to say. And then they may say something and feel, oh, I shouldn't have said that, because then the conversation went a different direction. So actually, an even more effective way might be to have the most senior person not talk first, but ask first. So have an open-ended question that leads off the conversation. So that lets people know, here's sort of what we're here for, because you're in a meeting after all. It's not completely unstructured, but not telling me what to say. So a lot of times we find higher ranking individuals use tag questions. So they say something like, well, we were looking at this, right? Instead of, what were we looking at the other day? Let's all talk about that, where it's more open-ended and it invites true conversation and true contributions without telling someone, here's where the conversation is going, and I want you to stay on that path. And I think that feeds into what you were saying. If you ask a question that's closed-ended, that only has one possible response, what you're telling your employees is this is the only possible way to go. If you start off with that open-ended question, then you're still leading the conversation. So junior people may not feel as vulnerable in speaking, but you're not telling them which way to steer the conversation. So you might have a less inhibited talk.
Love it. Well, everyone here is higher ranked than me, so they can say whatever they want. And they often do. Valerie, thank you so much. You have taught us so much. Tell everyone where they can find you and where they can learn more about you.
Well, you can check out my website at valeriefriedland.com, or I also write, like Ruth, for Psychology Today. And so my blog on Psychology Today is called Language in the Wild. You can also just look up University of Nevada at Reno, and I am there in the English department. So hopefully they'll find some way to connect.
Beautiful. Valerie, thank you so much for joining us. And Devin, Susie, and Bruce, thank you again for joining us. And Dr. Debbie Heiser in the background, the co-founder and CEO of the Mentor Project, who really just keeps the trains moving at all times while making us all look glamorous. Guys, we're going to be off for a couple of weeks and we will see you in the new year. And we have some amazing guests lined up. So stay tuned. Not to mention the end of January, we're going to do a special kickoff for my new book called The Success Factor. Everyone have a wonderful holiday, a happy new year, and please join us again in 2022. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Totally.
Bye. Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Like totally.